lovely warm evening in the garden. Thankfully, we're not going to absolutely roast in the marquee this evening. Nice bit of breeze coming in through the side, and always cool down with another glass of cordial. We're very pleased to welcome Woolley and Wallis back to Arundells again for this event, which is now in the second year of running, which is great. It's been nice to work alongside Woolley and Wallis to put on a few talks and events over the last couple of years, and we're very pleased to have them back again. And I'm very interested to hear about what they've got to tell us about the stories of the sea. So I shall hand over to John, Ned and Alex. Thank you very much.
Luke, thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Good evening. I'm John Axford. This evening, as you know, we're going to be looking at maritime history, as it says here. We're going to be discussing articles and artefacts that relate to England's swashbuckling naval past. We're also going to be looking at the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, of course, the French, and the Japanese actually as well. I'm going to be kicking off looking at privateers and wine glasses relating to privateers from the 18th century. Alexandra Aguila, she's going to be talking about a fantastic gold lacquer Japanese cabinet and Deshima Island. How many people know about Deshima Island? Hands? 1, 2, 3. Oh, yes. Your husband. Ned's going to be talking about prisoner of war ships, and they are really fabulous things. And there are 4 in the collection here at Arundells as well. Yeah, very looking forward to hearing that. So overall, we're going to be jumping around from the 16th century through the 17th with Alexandra, into the 18th with these wine glasses, and right up into the Napoleonic period with the prisoner of war ships. So we're roughly going to be talking for 15 to 20 minutes each. So if you could time me, please, a bit. I'll try not to go on too long. And we'll kick off. Right, privateers. Right, I think I pressed that. There we are. It says privateer. What is a privateer? Oh, why this talk came about. About a year ago or so, I was asked to handle the sale of a small collection of about 20, 25 18th century English wine glasses. Now, 20 may not sound like an awfully huge number to you, but actually it took this collector over 60 years to amass this collection. And so it really is very, very unusual to put this number together. I'm only going to be able to dust the surface because we only have 15 minutes. But anyway, so here's a little selection of some of the glasses. That's not his whole collection, that's a part of it. Now, privateers. What is a privateer? A privateer is a privately owned ship. So it's privately owned, it's not owned by the Navy, but it's been licensed by the Crown to attack our enemies during wartime. And we were mostly at war most of the time, so that's a fairly good thing. In order to be recognised as a privateer, you needed to get a licence, something called a letter of marque from the Crown, and that allowed you to capture enemy ships, to sell the cargoes, which were known as prizes. You could share then the proceeds with your investors and with the government and with the Crown. Without that licence, in the eyes of British law or English law at the time, you were a pirate. In the eyes of the rest of the world, you were a pirate anyway. So anyway, so it first really came about under the reign of Elizabeth I, and there she is. Oops, can go away. Ooh, this is a bit wacky. But there she is. So where are we looking? We're looking in the second half of the 16th century. Our most famous privateer is this chap, who many of you will recognise. This is Sir Francis Drake, our most famous privateer, one of our most famous sailors. And actually, according to Axford family legend, he's supposed to be a relative. I think it's rather doubtful, but he might be. A great-grandmother seemed to believe it was very true. She came from Tavistock. His ship, I don't know. He was very famous for circumnavigating the globe, the second circumnavigation in a ship between 1577 and 1580. That's about 10 years, of course, before the Spanish Armada. So we were busily fighting the Spanish then. But during that circumnavigation, if you saw an enemy ship, yeah, it was fair game. Most of the attacks by Drake were in the Pacific, on the coast of South America. And there's one particular ship, and this is to point out what big business it could be. There was a Spanish ship that we know in England as the Cacafuego. Is that the right pronunciation?
Yeah.
About. Anyway, this was a big Spanish galleon. He captured it. He managed to get 26 tons of silver, and there was gold. There was 36 kilograms of gold, as well as jewels, as well as other precious stones. This was about £1 billion in today's money. Now, that's a good day's work. I mean, that was, when are we talking, I said? 1579, Drake managed to get that. It made him absolutely immensely rich, sailing around there. Here's a picture of his ship. Very romanticised one. Definitely not contemporary. Looks like a late Victorian thing, but actually it was painted in 1917. It's very, very late. But that is the ship, or a picture of the ship, as imagined by Charles Dixon in the early 20th century. One of our most famous ships, after, of course, HMS Victory, and I suppose the Mary Rose is up there. But the Golden Hind was tied to exploration and the rise of England as a naval power. A couple of facts about the ship. It was originally named the Pelican. He renamed it, this is Drake renamed it, the Golden Hind, because his patron, Sir Christopher Hatton, his coat of arms featured a golden hind. But I don't think you should rename ships. It's bad luck. That's what I was told. And actually, he died at 55 in the Caribbean of dysentery, so he probably should have kept it as the Pelican. Let's have a think about that. And of course, it was famous for completing the second circumnavigation of the globe. He was knighted on his return a year after, on board ship by Elizabeth I. So glasses, we need to talk about privateer glasses. Even though our privateers were operating from the 16th century, in the 17th century, the glasses that relate to privateers, there's one. The glasses that relate to them all date from a really rather small window from about 1750 to 1760. Who are we fighting then? Got to be the French.
Has to be.
And the Spanish. It was the 7 Years' War, so we were fighting the French and the Spanish because they were our traditional enemies. I'm going to show you a few glasses now. And discuss how to recognise them, genuine ones from later copies. If you're really keen about this, there is actually a publication listing all the known named ships. And I point this out, it was published in 1930, nearly 100 years ago. So these have been collected for really, this is super wappy, really a long time. This glass. This is a standard 18th century wine glass of around 1756. It's got a typical bucket-shaped bowl, sort of square at the bottom. It's got a double series opaque twist stem. It's got a slightly domed foot, and underneath it's got a pontil mark, which is that rough bit that you can cut your thumb on if you're not careful. They're made in three parts. They make the bowl in one part, then the stem, and then the foot, and they join them together, put it on a pontil, snap it off, and there you go. You might look at it thinking, how would you use a glass like that on board a ship? It doesn't look really very stable. Well, you didn't. Simple. These are believed to have been ordered by the owners and the financial backers and the captains of these privateers' ships. So they weren't intended to be used at sea. They were intended to toast the success of your super financial venture. And they are usually inscribed success to. This particular one says success to the Eagle, but it could be the Hornet, the Anson, the Duke of Cornwall, the Oliver Cromwell, the Betsy, and quite a number of them also name the commander of the ship. Few words just since the Eagle frigate's here. This was a purpose-built ship, 250 tons, 24 guns, a crew of 340 men. It was owned by a certain Messrs. Caplin and Smith of Bristol, and Manslip and Wilkinson of London. They put the money up, and she was declared. That means she received her letter of marque, licensing her to go and do her stuff, or in 1756, and hence we can date the glass to either 1756 or very close to 1756. Since I'm an auctioneer, this was sold for a hammer price of £4,800. Here is another one, also inscribed with the eagle, but if you notice the stem is slightly different. This one sold for £8,800 hammer, so probably about 10,000 all in. Is that about right, Natalie? She's nodding, ish. Now, the reason I'm mentioning the prices, so you've got around 5,000, around 10,000. They can get up to about £20,000, very rarely. But I'm going to talk about, next thing is, how do you know if they're genuine? Because the same glass with no inscription is worth about £150. There lies the problem for people like us. So, you have glasses that are direct copies made in about 1900. Those are actually not that difficult to spot because it was made in 1900, which means the glass isn't quite right for 18th century glass. They usually get the proportions wrong. Actually, do we have one? No, not yet. And actually, quite often they don't even have a pontil mark underneath. It might be rounded off. So they're not the problems. The problem is when somebody gets an 18th century wine glass from 1750, 1760, and they find somebody who is a genius at engraving. There lies your problem. So what do you look for? Let's have a look at another one. Actually, I can't even see which one this is here. It is, this one has a slightly rounded bowl, doesn't it? Yeah. This one's inscribed, "Success to the Duke of Cornwall." The copyists, one thing to talk about is the engraving of the ship to start with. That is almost always done with a wheel engraving on genuine ones, but also on copies. And that's quite easy, if you're very good at it, to replicate. What's more difficult to copy is the inscription in the right style and in the right way. What you really want to see is the inscription. Actually, I have a slight closer up version of this one. You probably can't see it there, but the writing needs to be very good. But actually, I'll go one slide further. Right, that inscription is not done with a wheel. You can barely see it with your naked eye, actually. That's done with a diamond point. It's been scratched in by a diamond point. And that's a very good sign. If it's very good quality lettering, done with a diamond point, that's what you really want to see. You also want to see a glass that has the right shaped bowl. There are only a few types of bowls that we used. And also the right type of stem, because there are only a few designs of stem that are used. So if you get a bowl with an odd stem or an odd bowl, it's a warning sign. If you get a glass with badly executed engraving of the lettering, I mean, the Duke of Cornwall one, going back to it, it's done really rather nicely. That's really what you want to see, and that's a good, genuine glass, hopefully worth about £10,000. It hasn't come up for sale yet. Maybe a bit less, but we'll see. Another thing to look for, to see if it's genuine or not, is the ship. As I said, there was a book written in 1930 listing all the names. The Eagle seems to be the most common, by the way, but and actually this collection contained 3 glasses, success to the Eagle. If you come across a ship name that's never been seen before, why is that? since collectors have been trying to collect these avidly for over 100 years, why has never anybody seen that before? And there have been glasses that have come up with unheard of names, and sometimes they made a lot of money and then been denounced. So you've got to be careful. So provenance also, knowing where it's been, is a helpful thing. Right. How are we doing for time? Oh, right. Okay. Well, it's not too bad. Right. I'm going to move on fast. We looked at that slide already. So that's diamond point engraving. Whereas that writing there is quite different. That's wheel engraving. And actually, if you look at the bottom of that, the lettering there, it's kind of rounded at the top. If you imagine a wheel was pushed up there and then across there, it's quite different. And that is on a copy. Here is the whole thing. Now, you've got to watch auctioneers. This was bought from auction, from a London auctioneer as genuine. Fortunately, most specialists and most collectors realise that, and so it didn't fetch a huge price. But it was catalogued as a genuine glass. So you really do need to take advice from experts in the subject. Get as much advice and find out as much as you can for the glass. But anyway, I'm going to move on. I'm going to go right back now. So these are, apart from this one that's a copy, these were made in the 1750s, 1760s, in the 7 Years' War, or thereabouts. I'm going back now, briefly, to the back into the 16th century. Remember, Drake captured the... Caroline, do you remember the name of the ship? No. The Cacafuego. Shouldn't sit in the front row, you see. Drake captured the Cacafuego in 1579 with its enormous quantities of silver, gold, and other things, and this great fortune. A little later, after the Spanish Armada, in 1592, so right at the end of the 16th century, think Shakespeare, think a privateering expedition backed by Sir Walter Raleigh, no relation of mine this time, he captured a Portuguese ship known as a carrack, a huge treasure ship called the Mother of God, or the Madre de Deus, in the Azores, or near the Azores. This was taken back into Dartmouth, and in true West Country style, it was looted. Much of the treasure was stolen. But what was on board caused an absolute sensation, and nobody in England had really seen what was on there in these sort of quantities before. It was extraordinary. There were 3 tons of nutmeg. I'm just trying to think of the size of this tent, actually. There were 3 tons of nutmeg, 35 tons of cinnamon. Now, I mean, that must take a lot of space. There were 45 tons of cloves. I mean, they weigh nothing. 45 tons of cloves. But wait for it, 425 tons of peppercorns. How on one ship? That was as well as silks, precious stones, pearls, and porcelains. So this one ship that was brought back in to Dartmouth and looted, brought in an estimated value of half England's royal revenue. Now, we weren't the richest country at the time. I mean, I was trying to work this out earlier. A royal revenue wouldn't be the same as GDP, but it would be apparently equate to the government's annual revenue, which, according to Google, is 1.2 trillion today. But of course, we're a lot richer now than we were then. So half of that is about, I don't know, 600 billion pounds. So it wouldn't be anywhere close to that. But it was a huge, huge amount of money. But there is a reason I'm talking about this one, this ship. 2 reasons, actually. Does anybody here recognise this stone carving? Anyone? I'm jolly disappointed, actually. It's, what have we got? We've got Neptune in a ship. And there's a reason. It's on the gate. I'm talking about this because there's a certain Thomas Gorge, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing him right. He was an investor in this particular expedition I was talking about. He was an English courtier, he was a diplomat, and he very sensibly married a Swedish heiress noblewoman who was a lady in waiting to Queen Elizabeth I. She also happened to own a lot of land, including the Longford estate. Well done her, clever him. And with his share of the proceeds from that ship, with all that pepper, cinnamon, cloves, etc., he built or rebuilt Longford Castle into that. I mean, I think that's pretty impressive from a privateering expedition. You could achieve great things by your state-sponsored piracy back in the 16th century. Hence Neptune on the gates above the entrance to Longford. Right, I've got to sum up because am I 15 minutes yet? It must be 18. Oh, dear, sorry. Right, summing up quickly. Privateering, immensely important to England's naval history. But it's the values of the cargoes. And I wanted to stress, though, that's what helped motivate the creation of the East India Company in 1600, which did so much. I'm not going to get into politics, but it's known as the John Company, I think, wasn't it, originally? It was big business as well as warfare, which in the 18th century could be toasted with a delicate 18th century wine glass. And there are still some from that collection coming up for sale later that year. Thank you very much. Alexandra.
Right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming here tonight. And I hope you will enjoy our short talks. I'm Alexandra Aguilar, and I'm an Asian art specialist at Woolley and Wallis. Tonight, I would like to tell you the story of my favorite find as an auctioneer. A few years ago, a local client, came to our sale room at Castle Street, saying that he had an English cabinet he wanted to get valued. I asked to see the pictures, and he showed me this. And I knew that wasn't your average cabinet. I thought, this is Japanese, this is 17th century lacquer, and it's very rare. It relates to the Dutch East India Company. So I guess I need to start with that, with the Verenigde Oost-Indische Company, and I'm really sorry about my accent here, the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch started traveling to Asia at the end of the 16th century. The various Dutch provinces would put together companies that they would send on one-off expeditions to Asia, mainly to the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, it would very much be privateering rather than trading, really. They would plunder mainly Portuguese and Spanish targets at the time. But in 1602, the Dutch East India Company was founded, and its success was really unprecedented. In the 17th and the 18th century, the Dutch East India Company sent about 1 million Europeans to Asia on board 4,721 ships. At the time, the British East India Company, it was about twice as many ships. So the Dutch East India Company was really a huge thing. At its peak in the mid-17th century, the VOC was the most valuable company ever recorded in human history. And it was worth about £6 trillion in the mid-17th century. This is one of the early maps they used in the late 16th century. And this was based on Portuguese charts, which had just leaked out of Portugal in the late 16th century. I don't know if you can see. Can you see Japan on the map? Can you guess where it is? It's actually up here. This is China. It's the wrong way around, basically. And Korea is depicted as an island. But that's a different story. I don't have time for this now. So The Portuguese, they were the first Europeans to arrive in Japan. The first Portuguese arrived in 1543. There were 3 of them. They were merchants, and they survived a shipwreck in the south of Japan. And the local Japanese lord was very interested in them, and in particular in their guns, their matchlock guns, which he bought, and he had recreated in a couple of years. Japanese artisans remade those guns, and this was revolutionary in Japan, and it really changed things. There were many wars going on between different lords at the time, and having guns really helped. This started a very successful trading relationship between the Portuguese and the Japanese. And it's also worth noting that there were many missionaries, Jesuit missionaries on those ships, including the famous Francis Xavier, who became a saint. And apparently they converted about 200,000 people to Catholicism at the time. Now, that relationship between the Portuguese and the Japanese turned sour very quickly for many various reasons. The Japanese were worried as they could see that the Portuguese and the Spaniards were starting to conquer the Americas and large parts of Asia. So they really looked like a threat really to the Japanese establishment. The Portuguese also started trading in Japanese slaves in the late 16th century, which is a chapter in history that is not very well known, but they would take them all the way to Brazil, Mexico, Portugal, and even Rome. So you had Japanese slaves in late 16th century in Europe. So these were some of the reasons why the Japanese government started to be worried about the Portuguese being in Japan. They started meddling in Japanese politics as well, and Japanese converts, people who converted to Catholicism, started being involved in rebellions against the Japanese establishment. So in 1614, Catholicism was banned from Japan. The missionaries were asked to leave, and the converts were forced to renounce their faith, or they were executed in very gruesome ways. They were crucified, buried, or boiled alive. Many of them are now considered Catholic martyrs, actually. In 1639, that's when the shogun, the military leader, just had enough of the Portuguese in Japan. And so he issued the Sakoku edicts, which means that he closed Japan to the rest of the world. He didn't want foreigners in Japan anymore. And the Portuguese were expelled permanently from the country. The Dutch, however, they had been very clever. They had supported the Japanese establishment during those rebellions. And also they managed to convince the authorities that they weren't interested in converting people or meddling in Japanese politics. They were just there to trade. They just wanted to make money. So they were allowed to stay in Japan. They also had a very important mission, which was to write reports for the shogun, for the Japanese government, about what was going on in the rest of the world. So even though Japan was closed to foreigners, but for the Dutch and some Chinese merchants, they all still knew what was going on around the world. The only downside for the Dutch at the time was that they could only trade in Japan from one place, one small island called Deshima. This is Deshima Island. That's in the harbor of Nagasaki in the south of Japan. And that's what was painted on the side of the cabinet that I saw pictures of in Castle Street. And this is a very rare depiction. You don't see that on many cabinets. Deshima was an artificial island. The way to recognize it is really that fan shape. So it was man-made in the 1630s, originally for the Portuguese, but they only lived on it for about 3 years. It was very small. It was the size of maybe 2 football pitches. And John was trying to figure out earlier how many tents that would be. And I think you decided it would be about 18 of those tents. That was the size of the overall island. It's very small. And when I went there, it really feels that way. It feels like you couldn't live there all year long, really. Only about 20 Dutch merchants were allowed to live on the island at any given time. But the VOC still had to pay about £150,000 per year to use the island. There was only one bridge connecting it to the shore. And so the Japanese could really control the Dutch merchants there. They really had complete control over the Westerners. They were forbidden to leave the island, but for very special occasions. And that's what was depicted at the front of the cabinet, one of those special occasions. Every time there was a new chief merchant, a new governor, Dutch governor to the Shima, he had to go to Edo, which today we know as Tokyo. And he had to take gifts to the shogun, to the leader, and obtain permission to keep on trading. So the journey from Deshima to Edo, Tokyo, would take about 90 to 120 days. And yes, you would have about 150 to 200 people taking part in that procession. You can see the Dutch merchants here, so I'm not sure if it's visible, but they are wearing wide-brimmed hats. And this one here, he is the chief merchant, he's the governor, and he's being transported in a palanquin to Tokyo. Why not? So this is extremely rare to have this on a Japanese lacquer cabinet. You don't see that very often. This must have been really fascinating for Japanese people, seeing this long procession and those Dutchmen looking quite different. Actually, you can see a few of them coming out of their houses just to watch them. It must have been an incredible spectacle. And the Dutch really became a favorite subject for Japanese artists at the time. They looked so strange. And this is how they were typically depicted, with big hats, big noses, and bright red hair, as in that print over there by the famous artist Hokusai. And often also they were holding chickens. Because cockfighting was one of the only things they were allowed to do on the island. And also they would bring European poultry onto the island, which must have looked so exotic to Japanese artists at the time. There are huge archives relating to the VOC. There is about a mile long of archives in the National Archives of the Netherlands relating to the VOC. But there are also documents at the British Library in London, and everywhere you can find archives relating to the VOC, really. They tell us a lot about life on the Shima Island at the time. And for example, they talk about earthquakes happening or what they would eat when they were on the island. We also know that they weren't allowed to have European women on the island. And the Japanese authorities realized that was probably a bad idea. They should probably have access to female company on the island. And so local courtesans were asked to go and entertain the Dutch merchants on the Shima. It's a very well documented chapter in the history of the island, because many children were born out of those relationships. And also these courtesans were some of the first people to actually speak Dutch, because they would go on the island and meet the Dutch merchants and create those relationships. The archives also tell us what the Dutch merchants would take to Tokyo, to Edo, as presents for the shogun. And we know, for example, in the 1640s, the Dutch had several gifts. They brought with them a white hart, a deer, a magic stone that was supposed to help protect against poisoning. And they also brought along a dodo. This is actually the last ever recorded dodo. The last dodo that was alive in captivity in the world, and it was a gift to the shogun. the Dutch merchants had picked it up from Mauritius on their way to Japan. And they became extinct actually shortly after in the late 17th century. According to the Dutch, they weren't very flavoursome. We know that from the archives. So I'd like to think the shogun, the leader, kept it as a pet rather than try to eat it. But we won't know. There are actually no written records of that dodo or any visual records of it in Japanese archives. But if you happen to have something like this, please let me know. And this will become my next favorite piece, and I will talk about it. I have to say these are all AI generated. They are not real artworks, sorry. But if you do have one, please let me know. We also know that they took an elephant once to the shogun. Another time they took camels. And they didn't really know how to take care of those exotic animals. And there are records of them trying to feed them huge blocks of Dutch butter on these long sea voyages. So we don't know how many actually made it to Japan. But this may be one of the reasons why Dutch ships were nicknamed butter ships. So, as I mentioned, the VOC became hugely successful. And the merchants traded on Deshima for about 150 years. The VOC became a huge international corporation with its own coinage. It had the authority to wage wars, to establish new colonies, and so on. It was the first really multinational company with its own logo, its own recognizable logo, this monogram, the VOC. Which actually it's quite difficult to see, but it's on the ship here, which is on the side of our cabinet. It says VOC just there. After 1700, the VOC started to struggle for many different reasons, including the decline in trade for Japanese silver. And by the end of the 18th century, the company went bankrupt, and the Dutch government took over Deshima Island. To finish, finally, I should mention that that cabinet is extremely rare. There are only a few known in the world. There are these two here. This pair is in the royal collections in the Netherlands, and they were probably an extremely valuable gift from the VOC to the Dutch royal family. The one on the right-hand side is in the Musée des Beaux-Arts de Dijon in Burgundy, where I studied art history. It was purchased by a Burgundian aristocrat and collector in the 18th century, and it was seized during the French Revolution. So now it's in the public collections of the museum. To get back to our cabinet, according to the owner, his family had purchased that house on the right over there, which is in Cromer in Norfolk, together with its contents. And that house had originally been built and furnished by this gentleman here, Joseph Barclay, who was one of the richest members of the Barclays banking family. He built and furnished the house and to be used as a holiday property. He actually lived in Japan for about 18 years in the early 20th century. The cabinet is not recorded in any archive, at least not any publicly available. But I like to think he is the one who actually first purchased that cabinet and knew what it was. We'll probably never know how that cabinet went from Japan to the Netherlands, to Cromer, to then Salisbury, where Woolley and Wallis sold it for over £100,000 hammer in 2021. But I'm glad to say it's now back in the Netherlands, and maybe one day it will go back to Japan. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Hello, good evening. Right, here we are. I'm going to be talking about these modelled ships. They were, most of them at least, were produced in the late 18th and early 19th century. They're made by prisoners of war, held in various locations in England. and Scotland indeed. And part of their merit is very obvious just by looking at them. They're absolutely spectacular. Even the least of them are impressive. And this is a really good example. This is one of the ones in the house here, HMS Mars. You can see the attention to detail, the meticulous workmanship is really quite sublime. And they also have the appeal of being contemporary with the ships that they represent, and in that they have been made by men who participated in the fighting. And those factors give them a really sort of immediate, provide a really immediate connection to the age of fighting sail, as it is known. Now we're going to be focusing on the period from 1793 to 1815. That is the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Prisoner of war models did exist prior to that, but it was this period that really saw the flourishing of this material culture. And it is from there that most of the models we now know originate. They raise a fascinating question, really, these things, I think, because it doesn't take much imagination to think that the conditions under which these prisoners lived were absolutely grim. Squalor and deprivation. And now if somebody told you that this model had been made by an accomplished hobbyist in a well-equipped workshop, you'd still be pretty impressed, wouldn't you? And if somebody showed you a very crude bit of whittling, something that looked like a carrot with a tree sticking out of it, and said, well, this is a ship made by a prisoner of war, you'd think, well, yeah, good effort. Well done, that man. But the conjunction of these factors actually occurs between the squalor and the deprivation and these terrific ships. And that really is something to be wondered at. So who are these prisoners? They were a very mixed bunch, but in the early phase of this period, there was a strong predominance of naval personnel. And basically this is because for roughly the first half of the period in question, the Royal Navy had a fantastic time duffing up the French left, right and centre, whereas the British Army was struggling, really. So in the 1790s, you had several major fleet actions, notably the glorious 1st of June, 1794, when we captured something in the order of 3,000 prisoners. Similar number were taken at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, 1797. And Trafalgar, of course, the big one, hooray, we took 7,500 there. There were other battles where we didn't manage to come away with any. Aboukir Bay, for example, we gave the French what for there, but had to put all the prisoners ashore for logistical reasons. But there were also lots of small boat actions, frigate actions, blockading activity that generated a lot of civilian prisoners from merchant ships. And indeed also the capture of a lot of privateers, the sort of people John was talking about earlier. That activity continued. And so there were lots of men incarcerated here who had direct knowledge of these sorts of ships and who were, in many cases, craftsmen and tradesmen. They were carpenters, sailmakers, rope makers, and that sort of thing. And that was one very important ingredient, of course, in their ability to produce these models. But those conditions existed in other prisoner of war populations. The British prisoners, naval prisoners in France, there weren't all that many of them, it has to be said, but they would have possessed similar knowledge and similar skills. They didn't produce anything like this body of work. And I think the reason for the difference is probably found more in the French army, because even though we struggled on land, we took some prisoners during the Low Countries campaign in the early 1790s. We took various prisoners of the French army in their colonial possessions. And we had also quite a large number of French army prisoners from our allies, such as the Austrians. Part of the support we gave to them, as well as lots of money, was that we would relieve them of the prisoners that they struggled to look after. And the important thing about prisoners from the French army is that the conscription system that the French operated in the revolutionary Napoleonic period scooped up people from all walks of life. It didn't matter if you were a professional, an educated person, a skilled labourer. You were eligible to serve in the army, and therefore you were liable to end up in a British prison facility. And you brought with you all sorts of skills. And it gave rise to a really sort of vibrant, flourishing culture. Not only ships, all sorts of other things were made, tea caddies and toys and automata, and they gave dancing lessons, language lessons, and this, I think, is accounted for, as I say, by the army component of the prison population. Where did they live? Well, there are three main ways of housing these prisoners, and in order from grimmest to least grim, these were prison hulks, which were converted naval vessels. So a redundant ship would have all its masts and rigging and guns and so forth stripped away. It would be fitted with bars and fortified bulkheads, and you'd cram in as many prisoners as you could, and it would lie at anchor in a harbour. There were prisons established ashore, sometimes quite small-scale ones in existing ports like Portchester near Portsmouth, and then latterly in purpose-built prisons like Norman Cross and Dartmoor. And then others of them would be allowed to live among the civilian population under terms known as parole, whereby they had to swear not to try and escape, not to try and resume hostilities, and generally to behave themselves. And this was invariably this was officers to whom this was available, and they could live out in the civilian population. But before I move on to how the ships are made, I'd just like to give you a bit of an idea of how nasty it could get. There was at Chatham a prison hulk called the Brunswick. And one of the things that happened when you converted these ships was that they started to float higher in the water because a lot of weight had been removed. And the lowest deck of the ship, known as the orlop deck, which was normally below the waterline, would come up above the waterline, and it could have little barred ventilation holes made in the sides, and you could stuff extra prisoners in there. And the orlop deck of the Brunswick corresponded in plan view almost exactly to the gravel area in front of the house that you would have crossed as you came through the gates. So that little oval of gravel, not the grass at the sides, just the gravel itself, is the plan view. The height was 4 foot 10 inches, which is, I'm going to come off the stage to show you because it's only about to there. And living in that space in 1813, there were found to be no fewer than 460 men. And, you know, we're talking sweaty, hairy men at that, so not a pleasant place to be. Why did they do it? Well, they did it partly, I think, to alleviate their boredom, but the main reason was in order to sell them. These ships could be sold, as could all the other products that they made. And money was very important to prisoners because although they were allocated a certain amount of food, with money you could buy better food, you could bribe a guard to give you somewhere nicer to sleep, generally make your life more pleasant. This wasn't a furtive activity. They didn't have to hide their models when the guards came round. The prison authorities encouraged this sort of thing because it kept the prisoners out of trouble, kept them from losing their minds. And also, of course, if you're a prison warder, you're likely to be the beneficiary of some of this economic activity. When a prisoner approaches you to ask for an extra sausage or whatever, you get some of the money. So it worked for everybody. How did they make them? Well, I've drawn a little picture here. I did this in the orlop deck of a hulk, so excuse me if it looks a bit rough. The first thing you had to make was your hull. I haven't spoken much yet about materials. They're commonly referred to as bone ship models because, generally speaking, bone is the predominant visible material on these models. And bone came from the food that they ate. It was readily available. But you had to have something to attach the bone to. So here are some cross sections to give you an idea of how the hulls might be made. And just very briefly, most of them are made out of a solid piece of wood. You carve it into the shape of a hull and you then apply the bone planking to the outside. More sophisticated, but also harder to make and therefore rarer, more prized by collectors, were models that were made on a frame. So here you have, and again it's a cross section, but if you imagine that's the keel, and it would have a stem and a stern post, and then it would have these frames set up at intervals along it. Not quite like a real ship at the time, but more like a small boat would be made, and you would apply your bone planks to the sides of that. And then there were variations on the theme. The one at the far side there is a solid core with the top deck hollowed out down to the level of the gun deck, so that you could put in the little cannons inside and other sort of interesting interior details. That's the same idea, but with partial frames set up. And then some models have a solid plate in the middle, out of which the keel and the stem and the stern are made, and then solid blocks attached to the outside. And then you have to start work on your planking and your rigging and your spars and your masts. And again, as you can see, it is nearly all bone on this example. Other materials were wood, but that was harder to get to. And somewhere here, whizzing through, oh, it's gone. I was going to show you, oh yes, here it is. This dark material here, which is used to represent what are called the whales of the ship, which were strakes that were reinforced. That is baleen from the mouth of a filter-feeding whale. And the planking was incredibly difficult to do. It's a little bit deceptive, perhaps. You look at that and you think, well, okay, so what? They've just nailed a whole load of flat bits on. Not at all. Very, very difficult to shape them, curve them to the shape of the hull. They typically had to be boiled or soaked in vinegar to cause them to bend and retain a curve. What look like little nails are actually tiny copper wires inserted through holes that they would drill, and then they flatten out the tops with a hammer, so they have more in common with rivets than with nails. And then carved details, like the figureheads here, and I'm going to be going back and forth like mad, I can see, and the stern galleries, the quarter galleries. In order to do them really nicely, you had to make sure that the carving was joined up and continuous around 3 separate pieces. So they typically did those on some sort of a jig and carved them and then applied them to the ship. People often wonder what relation they bear to real naval vessels of the time, and it is an interesting question. And the answer is that it's a bit of a patchwork. Some, like Mars here, are very, very realistic, and if you compare it to a real ship, you won't find much to quibble about. But very often there are glaring discrepancies. They have the wrong number of guns, usually too many guns because they got overexcited. You'll find that there are things that just couldn't work, like cannon that would destroy your own superstructure if you fired them. And sometimes you find over-elaboration, so, fretwork on the keel or something like that. But a lot of these models are named. So here we have Mars, also in the collection. We have Impregnable and Prince. And the name on the ship doesn't necessarily suggest that the person making it had intimate knowledge of that ship. Very often you find French-looking features on a model with a British name. And the obvious reason for that, of course, is that the man making it was familiar with French ships, not with British ones. But when it came to naming it, he made the shrewd decision to do something popular like, Victory or whatever, so that it would sell well. There aren't actually huge difference between British and French ships in this period, and over the course of the period they tended to converge. But this actually does have a very good and correctly English stern gallery there, slightly stepped at the corners. The French ones are much more hooped, like inverted horseshoes. Structurally speaking, forget it. As I've already said, most of them are just solid wood on the inside. It's thrilling to think that you might peer in and, through a porthole, through a hatch or something, and see exactly what a French or British ship would have been like structurally. And if you've seen the film Master and Commander with Russell Crowe, one of his crew makes him a model of a French ship, and he's very, very thrilled, Captain Aubrey, because he can see how best to destroy it with cannon fire.
This doesn't apply here, because even when they are built up on frames, they're nothing like the real ships. These frames are very much spaced out and quite spindly. The frames of a ship like HMS Victory were extremely substantial, very broad, and only had a few inches gap in between them. They were an important structural part of the hull, not just a skeleton on which to attach the planks. Now, you're probably all wanting to rush off home now and start your own collections. So a few words about what to look for. One of the most important things, one of the hardest things for them to get right, was the planking. So let's see if I can find a better picture. The planking here is very, very good, once again. It should be symmetrical. You should find that the strakes, and a strake is a continuous course of planking along the side of a ship, it should run from stem to stern uninterrupted. On the poorer models, you quite often find that they sort of interleave them to make up for problems in getting the proportions right at either end. It's extremely difficult to do this because the strake, as it proceeds along the side of the ship, varies in thickness, narrower at the ends, obviously, where the ship tapers, but also its axial orientation will change. It'll start off like that if it's near the keel, and then it'll have to do that, and then it'll have to do that as it comes to the front. Really fiddly. Riggings and sails and everything else, sorry, not sails, there are hardly ever sails on these things. The rigging and the spars should be in proportion. You should find that for example, the stays and the shrouds should be thicker than the ratlines that run horizontally across them. On a poor model, you may find that it looks more like a uniform net. And sometimes you might find lovely refinements like interior seams or guns that retract inside when you pull a cable. All very good. And you may, if you're lucky, get a nice baseboard, a nice contemporary baseboard, or even here a box. This is a straw marquetry box, and straw marquetry, other than bonework, was the other thing that these prisoners were particularly known for. Finally, auctioneers are always asked about values, so I'm going to forestall those questions by telling you what you might expect to have to pay for these things if you find them at auction. Even the most basic ones fetch anything from sort of £2,000 to £5,000 at auction. So it's not a cheap hobby, I'm afraid to say, having encouraged you to take it up. Anywhere in the £5,000 to £30,000 region gets you something really quite superior. And the best of them, the very best, hover at around the £50,000 mark at auction. One standout result that was reached earlier this year and is obliquely relevant to the house and collection here actually belonged to Margaret Thatcher. It was a boxwood model of HMS Victory. Wood models are very desirable because it was hard of them to get hold of, good quality wood. That made £92,000. And the very highest price I've come across, which was actually found by John when he was out and about at an antique, high-end antique fair, and a dealer there had a model for sale for £175,000, which is really pretty anomalous, and I think mostly just goes to show that if you're determined to spend vast sums of money, you will always find somebody willing to help you. Right, well, that's it from me. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. Next picture. There we go. Thank you. I think we may just about have time for you to correct us on anything that you've been waiting to talk about. So, microphone coming there, sir. Thank you very much.
Just give us an indication of how long it would take the prisoners to make these models. And secondly, are there hundreds of them around or thousands?
Excellent questions. Hard to say how long it took, simply because there were no records kept of any of that. But it would have been, I would guess, perhaps up to a year, something like that. Bear in mind, they had a lot of time on their hands. Some of them were here for the entire sort of 20-year period. Also, they were often made by syndicates, so it wouldn't be just one man doing it. There'd be one guy doing the carving, one guy doing the planking, one guy doing the rigging, so that would speed things up. And as to the second question, it's hundreds rather than thousands, but certainly several hundreds known. Anyone else? Oh, gentleman on the end there. And please think of questions for my colleagues too, because I'm getting quite dry.
Sorry to keep you confined, Ed. I was thinking of tools, prisoners of war, when they give me something else.
That's an excellent point. Yes, tools can be weapons. Things like, there are a few things that we know. So it appears that drills were often made by taking needles and flattening out the ends, and then you make a sort of a crude wooden thing to turn them with. They did have access to tools because quite a lot of them were put to work within the prisons on sort of labouring jobs. There are examples of repurposed files, things like that they've turned into knives for carving. Lots of ingenuity. It's also possible that they were lent tools by the prison warders because, as I said, they were keen for the French to do this kind of thing. And if you're lending them, you can have them back at the end of the day, and that mitigates the risk of violence. Microphone on the way, sorry.
Thank you very much. In the cathedral, in the cloister, there were a lot of Dutch prisoners, but I don't know which era this comes from. And they drew some little pictures in stone.
Quite possibly the same period. We did capture a lot of Dutch. They were in cahoots with Napoleon for quite a lot of this period. We defeated them at sea as well. At the Battle of Camperdown, although I believe there were no prisoners taken then, I think they went straight ashore. But a lot of them were actually directly in the service of the French. So I'm not sure in that case, but it's very likely that it was the same period. Yeah. We must have a look at that. Anything for John and Alex?
Yeah, I have one for John. You mentioned that the privateers commissioned the glasses. Did they commission just one, or a whole set, or a dinner service, or what?
It's not very well recorded, but it is thought that they would have several of them. As I said, the Eagle crops up again and again and again, and you do see the same names of the same ships turning up in collections, which does suggest that if you were sponsoring a ship, if you were a financial backer, you may have ordered a set of glasses. So all of you could toast the success of whatever it was, the Hornet or the Revenge or this, that and the others. So they were probably ordered in small numbers for a particular purpose for a few people at a time, rather than mass produced.
There's a lady in... Oh.
Sorry. Just wondering where these glasses were made.
Well, the privateers, as I said, an awful lot of the glasses were Bristol, or I have Bristol ships on them. Some of them have Liverpool ships, but I think an awful lot of the glass was made in Bristol particularly because they have the same type of bowls and stems and feet. So largely Bristol, but there were other places as well. You do get privateer glasses from London and Glasgow and Liverpool, as I said. But glass is difficult. Unlike ceramics, when you have a kiln, when things go wrong, you throw it out behind the building. And so you end up with a pile of shards, which historians and archaeologists can dig up and see what was there. When glass goes wrong, you throw it back in the pot and melt it. So you just do not have the same information in anywhere near the amounts that you would with ceramic factories.
Going back to the letter of marque you were talking about.
Yes.
Were they all documented? But presumably they were authorised, in inverted commas, because I believe one of our ancestors was a captain of a letter of marque. And I just wonder how to go about tracking which ship he was on.
I think Ned will know the answer better than me. I think they were documented, but help me out.
A letter of marque, it is a letter, it looks a little bit like a grant of dignity or a grant of arms or something like that. It's done in the same style. And it will go on and on about, wherefore we have now fallen out with the French again and we hate them and we authorise you to arm a ship and off you go. But if the letter in question relating to your ancestor is not extant, it would be difficult. I'd probably perhaps start by looking at the National Archives and other places like that, look in the indexes of big national archives and see who has a collection of those.
It was news to me until I saw a portrait, which
Right.
I thought inherited. And it may have been a ship behind it, but I know that's going back a long time ago that I saw it. So.
It is dimly possible I might be able to help when I'm back at my desk, so keep in touch and I'll see if I can help.
One more.
Alexandra, I just want that cabinet. I don't know if you mentioned, but what was it used for?
Oh,
Clothes, shoes, or treasure? Or?
Many of them were used for paperwork, for documents. And especially this one, I didn't show the inside. It wasn't that relevant for this lecture, but when you opened the doors, there were many drawers of different sizes, and most of them were quite narrow. So yes, mostly documents for this kind of documents. But yes, most of the ones actually produced for the Dutch East India Company were for documents. There are some that are quite strangely shaped, and they were for hats, for example, round ones.
Excellent. Well, thank you to the three of you for this evening. It's been fascinating to learn a bit more about these different objects. I hope you'll all join me in giving them another round of applause. And if anyone's interested in learning a bit more about the Napoleonic prison of Norman Cross in particular, up near Peterborough, there's an excellent book by Paul Chamberlain, who came and gave a talk for us earlier in the year about the conditions there at the prison, and helps give a bit more historical context to these interesting models. Thank you very much to the three of you.
Thank you.